Hello, everybody. Welcome to tonight's event, the Yom Kippur War 50 years later. I'm Andrew Lapin, a senior reporter at the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. This virtual event is brought to you by 70 Faces Media, which is the largest and most diverse Jewish digital publisher in North America. We're home to My Jewish Learning, Kveler, The Nasher, Hey Alma, the New York Jewish Week, and of course, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, your hosts for this evening's program. My guest tonight is the very talented Israeli journalist Matti Friedman. Matti is an award-winning journalist and author. His work has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Tablet, Smithsonian, and elsewhere. Matti's most recent book, Who by Fire, Leonard Cohen and the Sinai, was published in 2022 in the US, Canada, Israel, and Italy. His previous book, Spies of No Country, Secret Lives at the Birth of Israel, won the 2019 Natan Prize and the Canadian Jewish Book Award. Pumpkin Flowers, A Soldier's Story of a Forgotten War, was chosen in 2016 as a New York Times notable book and one of Amazon's 10 best books of the year. His first book, the Aleppo Codex, won the 2014 Sami Rohr Prize and the ALA's Sophie Brody Medal. His books have been translated into more than a dozen languages. Matti was born in Toronto and lives in Jerusalem. This year, we are marking the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War, a rather grim anniversary. And so we felt that Who by Fire would be a great lens through which to commemorate and discuss this momentous event. The book covers the events of the war from the perspective of the beloved Jewish folk singer Leonard Cohen, who visited Israel amid the chaos and destruction and wound up playing a series of concerts for soldiers on the front lines. It's a really remarkable tale. The book is also told from the perspective of the Israeli soldiers who saw him playing his haunting melodies, even as they were on the verge of losing everything. So thank you, Matti, for joining us from Israel. I know it's quite late over there. And thank you to all of you for watching, tuning in from home, wherever you are. Please feel free to leave your questions in the chat or your memories, any thoughts you'd like to share, and we will be monitoring it. We will try to get to some of them a little bit later in the hour. So Matti, let's talk first. A lot of research obviously went into this book from your end. You not only obtained access to never before seen Leonard Cohen archives, but you also interviewed a number of veterans of the Yom Kippur War who shared their stories with you. So tell us a bit about why and how you decided to tell the story of the war, through these two lenses, and what it was like to talk to these people who had seen these things.
First of all, thank you so much for having me. Thanks to to everyone who put the event together, 70 Faces and JTA, and to you, Andrew, for agreeing to do it. And it's wonderful to see all the locations coming up on the chat, from Santa Monica to Indiana and even Toronto. I saw my hometown, of course. So hi to all the 12 Canadians. And of course, we're gathered here to celebrate a great Canadian. The idea came to me in 2009 when Leonard Cohen showed up in Israel for a concert, which was part of that great Resurrection tour that many of you probably remember. Of course, Leonard Cohen is a great, folk hero of the 60s and 70s, and his career persists into the 80s and 90s, and then he largely falls out of the public eye. He goes to a Zen monastery for a while, and then as a man in his 70s, goes back on the road. And part of it is a creative drive to perform again. Part of it has to do with the fact that his manager had stolen all of his money while he was in seclusion, and so he goes back on the road without really knowing if anyone wanted to see him, and it ends up being this absolute eruption of affection for Leonard Cohen, and he's filling stadiums across the world. And that first Resurrection tour ended in Israel, in Tel Aviv, in the fall of 2009. I was born in Toronto, as I said, and I grew up with Leonard Cohen in the background. Like, I don't really remember the first time that I heard Leonard Cohen, because Suzanne was always on in the background, and So Long Marianne, and Sisters of Mercy. So he was just always part of my soundtrack. But when he showed up in Israel, Israelis went crazy for Leonard Cohen, and the phone lines crashed when the tickets went on sale, and 50,000 people came out to see Leonard Cohen in a pretty small country. And I just couldn't figure out what was going on. I didn't know that Leonard Cohen was so beloved in Israel. I thought of him basically as a Canadian icon. And I couldn't figure out exactly what the connection was. And then I read an article in one of the Israeli papers, Yediot Achronot, about this very strange concert tour that had happened in the Yom Kippur War. And it was unclear exactly what he was doing here or how he got here or what had happened, but it was clear that something very powerful had happened on the Sinai front in October 1973. Leonard Cohen was there, and that clearly explained part of this very intense connection that Israelis felt with him. And at the time, I decided that someone had to write about it. And that was 2009, so I've never actually written a book. I didn't know how to go about doing it, but I just had the idea that someday, someone should probably look into this story. And eventually it was me. You can do the math. It took 13 years to do it, but it came out last year.
That's wonderful. And I see Canadian representation is continuing in this chat, as we might expect. Very heavy interest from Canada and the Canadian diaspora. But the book is really so interesting because it is not just the story of Leonard Cohen, right? It is the story of the Yom Kippur War and the way in which this very improbable and, as you write, very in some ways like poorly reported event sort of resulted in the intersection of these two almost historical figures. So talk a bit about when you were conducting these interviews with the people who had seen Leonard Cohen perform in this totally absurd setting. What were they telling you? What were their experiences like?
Right. So there were two parts to this story, as you say. One was Leonard Cohen, and the other was the war. And I started out with very little information about Leonard Cohen because Leonard Cohen almost never mentioned the war. And at the beginning, when I started out, I was just working with an absence of information from Cohen. And actually, I had the idea again in 2009 when Leonard Cohen was very much alive, and I didn't know how to get to Leonard Cohen. It just seemed like an impossible thing to do. And then I published a book called Pumpkin Flowers, which was published by a Canadian publisher called McClellan and Stewart, which happens to be Leonard Cohen's publisher. So in 2016, I realized that I had a connection to Leonard Cohen, and I asked my editor if I could get to Leonard Cohen because I needed to talk to him about the war because I couldn't write a book about this without knowing what Leonard Cohen thought. And he said, yeah, I think we can do that. And I said, really? I could just interview Leonard Cohen? And he said, yes, just write a summary of the book you want to write. And we're going to get it to Leonard Cohen's people, and we're going to set up a meeting. So I said, great. I sat down and I wrote the kind of the bare bones of the idea. I attached this famous photograph, which I can show you in a moment, of Leonard Cohen standing next to Ariel Sharon in the desert in Sinai, which I thought would jog his memory. And I emailed it off to my editor. This is the fall of 2016. And I went to sleep convinced that within a few weeks, maybe a few months, I would be in Montreal interviewing Leonard Cohen. Never mind that Leonard Cohen had lived in Los Angeles for decades. In my imagination, of course, this was happening in Montreal. And I woke up the next morning with an email from my editor, and the subject line of the email was, pardon my French, holy shit. And it was just a link to the obituary. And Leonard Cohen had just died. And I was despondent. I was despondent because Leonard Cohen had died, but I was also despondent for very selfish reasons, which was, that I needed to interview Leonard Cohen, and I wasn't going to be able to. So in the absence of Cohen, eventually I struck gold and found something he'd written about the war that had never been published. But in the absence of Cohen, I set out to interview the soldiers who had seen Cohen. And I'd find a name in a newspaper article about this tour, and I would, find the person and their phone number, this being Israel, that's possible. And I would call the guy and I'd be like, hi, Reuven, I'm writing a book about Leonard Cohen in Sinai. I heard that you saw him. And Reuven would say, no, that wasn't me, but you should call my friend Moshe. I think he saw him. And I would call Moshe, and Moshe would pass me on to Chani, and Chani would pass me on to Pnina. And that's the way it went for quite a while, being passed around from these wonderful Israelis, now in their 70s, but at the time, 18, 19, 20-year-old soldiers. And I began to piece together the story of this tour through the experiences of the soldiers, because there was no other record. There's no official record of this tour. Officially, it never happened. The country was preoccupied with weightier matters at the time, and no one was keeping an account of Leonard Cohen's tour. There was no video crew. We have no video from the tour. We have barely any audio. So all of the information we have about the tour is hiding in the memories of soldiers who were there and in the personal photo albums of people who happened to snap a shot of him. And I began to put that together. And that was really what I did for, a year or two as I tried to, understand what had happened. But it was really subterranean history. It didn't exist anywhere, and there was no official record that was going to help me, and unfortunately no Leonard Cohen who was going to help me, so I had to go about it in a very different way.
Yeah. You write in the book about how the Yom Kippur War has continued to have, such deep, profound resonance on Israel and on Israelis. So let's, maybe for members of our audience who maybe are not so familiar with the specifics of this war, can we help help them understand a little bit more about why it has this legacy and what made it such a pivotal and in many ways shocking moment in modern Israeli history?
We're really feeling it right now. Of course, Yom Kippur was, it just happened, and we're marking 50 years, as you mentioned, since the war. So the war is on, I don't know about everyone's mind, but it's definitely on the national mind. There's been a lot of investigative reports and TV series. Every year on Yom Kippur, Israel remembers the war. For Israelis, Yom Kippur, the religious holiday, and Yom Kippur, the war, are inseparable. The memories of the war are just wrapped up in the day. And, we call it the War of Atonement, as if the war itself were an atonement. And for, the pride and euphoria that led Israel into the disastrous errors of that war. So every year we remember the war, but this year in particular, it's been 50 years, and there's been this real outpouring of memory from veterans of the war. It's really an earthquake that changes Israel. Israel after the Yom Kippur War is not the Israel that existed before that war. Abroad, people think much more about the 6-Day War, that being this great kind of heroic moment. But for Israelis, in many ways, the Yom Kippur War is as important, if not more important. It shatters the country's faith in the labor Zionist leadership. That the great kind of kibbutz generation that had founded the country is completely discredited by the war because they hadn't seen it coming and they hadn't prepared the army. Within a few years of the war, Labor loses an election for the first time, and Likud comes to power, and this is directly connected to the war. Israeli music changes, so it becomes less collective, less about we, less about making the desert bloom. Someone once told me, as I was researching the book, that one of the fatalities of the Yom Kippur War was the accordion, because after the war, you no longer hear the accordion in Israeli music, and it becomes something else. It becomes music that sounds a lot more like Leonard Cohen, actually much more individual. Groups who you wouldn't have heard from before the war become empowered and begin speaking out. Jews who came to Israel from the Arab world, the settlement movement gets going after the Yom Kippur War. A movement called Peace Now gets going after that war. So the society kind of fractures, becomes more heterogeneous, and more democratic, maybe, but also not the heroic Israel that still persists, I think, in many ways in the minds of North American Jews. The Israel of the kibbutz, that Israel really is shattered by this war. The war is only 3 weeks, but it changes the country, and for many people, it hasn't ended. The echoes of the Yom Kippur War persist to this day.
Yeah. Let's stay with that moment a bit historically, because you mentioned the 6-Day War and how that was like a moment of triumph for Israel, and so what is happening, in the years leading up to the Yom Kippur War that is creating this sense of, you're sort of describing like a sense of complacency or something. Like what is that like to experience for Israelis at the time, and why is this happening?
Right, the 6-Day War was this great unexpected victory that seemed to vindicate the founding generation. So, the Israel manages to win a war on 3 fronts. They're outnumbered, and yet there's this fantastic victory, and Israel captures a lot of territory. And of course, this victory ends up being much more complicated, and the territories that Israel conquered end up being, not all good for Israel, but it's a moment of triumph, and the generals can do no wrong, and it's just 6 years of euphoria during which the army lets its guard down, and the political leadership forgets that not all of Israel's problems have been solved, and there are still very real threats, and that there are enemies on our borders who have been humiliated by our army in the Six-Day War and are waiting for a chance to exact revenge. And that happens on the afternoon of Yom Kippur, October 6, 1973 at 2 p.m. And the Yom Kippur War in many ways is the extension of the Six-Day War. In a similar way, World War II is kind of the second chapter of World War I. There's unfinished business, and in some ways it's one war. But the Israelis, unlike in the Six-Day War when they were very on the ball and the Air Force was ready to go and the country was very much mobilized and ready for the war, when Yom Kippur comes around in 1973, Israel's complacent and the borders are ludicrously undefended, and there's just a scattering of infantry and tank crews on the borders in Sinai and in the Golan. And when the surprise attack comes on two fronts at 2 p.m., the defenses are overrun almost immediately, and it becomes clear that Israel has been caught completely off guard. And ultimately, the war ends with something that is pretty clearly a victory, but it doesn't feel like a victory. It feels like a defeat. And Israel loses 2,600 fatalities in just 3 weeks. And this is a country of barely 3 million people. So this is a really small place, and it's absolutely traumatized by the war, and almost every family in Israel was touched by it in some way. So in many ways, it's a bigger event than the Six-Day War, and one that it's harder to remember, right? It's not Jerusalem of gold. It's something much more complicated. And when it's remembered afterward in Israel, it's remembered as a lesson. It is remembered as a kind of atonement for letting our guard down. It's remembered as a lesson that we cannot trust the political leadership or the army. That the trauma of that surprise, that sense that it's coming out of nowhere, and that we almost lost the country because we were foolish, that sentiment persists. And I think in some ways it persists to this day. I mean, I'll give you one example. When I was in the army here in the late 90s, we were doing these training exercises that had nothing to do with the actual missions that we were entrusted with in the late 90s. In the late 90s, we were involved in this small guerrilla war with Hezbollah, but we were training in the desert with columns of tanks and columns of infantry. And I realized years later that we were training to fight the Yom Kippur War. That was the war that the army wanted to win this time, even though 20, 30 years had passed and it was clearly not going to happen again. But the scar was so deep that they were going to train the army decades later to deal with the same threat.
Wow, yeah, there's certainly a lot of parallels to how militaries here in America and elsewhere are still preparing decades later for what they did not see coming at the time. You described this so evocatively in the book, but the Yom Kippur War is sort of infamous for the way in which it begins with this sneak attack by Egyptian and Syrian forces that happens on the holiest day of the Jewish calendar. And why was this in particular so monumental for the Israeli army, that this was falling on Yom Kippur? You talk in the book about the soldiers who were just sort of hanging out right in the desert and not expecting any of this, and suddenly their lives are changing. So can you kind of describe for us the significance of this date and why it was so nobody thought this was going to happen?
Right. I mean, I see that someone in the chat mentions the movie Golda, which just came out, also part of the kind of resurgence of memory of this war. I'm sure many of you have been in Israel for Yom Kippur, and if you haven't, you should come, because it's completely unique. The entire country shuts down. So not everyone in Israel is religious, of course, but on Yom Kippur, many people observe the fast. There are no cars in the street. There are no flights in and out of the airport. There are no TV broadcasts, no radio broadcasts. The country really shuts down in a way that's very unique. So it's a day on which Israel is particularly vulnerable. Although afterwards, some will claim that because the roads were completely empty, it was actually easier for the army to move forces around on Yom Kippur, and that was a form of divine intervention. One of my interviewees in the book told me that he thought that the war broke out on Yom Kippur, so as a kind of gift from God, because the army could then transport forces back and forth from the front. But it's remembered as a kind of sucker punch that Israel is observing the holiest day of, or the most solemn day of the Jewish calendar. I'm trying to be exact. People are preoccupied with other things, and it's look, I mean, all's fair in love and war, but it was a particularly vulnerable day for an attack, and of course that's why it was chosen. And the sirens go off when people are in synagogue, and initially people think it might be a training exercise, then they might think it might be some kind of light skirmish, and then it becomes clear that this is something really, really big, and that Israel's been attacked on two fronts, and that Israel might lose the war. And it takes a few days for that to become apparent, but it's quite clear very early on. And then over the next 2 or 3 weeks, the army has to fight like crazy to dig itself out of the hole that it found itself in on the first day of the war, Yom Kippur, 1973.
One thing that I found so interesting in your book is that, like, the nature of this attack, once the news of it is sort of spreading throughout the world, it is compelling Jews all over the world to get on the first flight they can to come to Israel, even those who may not have necessarily thought of themselves as being connected to Israel or thought of themselves as being particularly religious. And of course, Leonard Cohen was one of them. Talk about, why do you think so many people were pulled to Israel at that moment, particularly Leonard Cohen?
Well, I think that it's kind of hard to understand from today when, certainly for younger people of my generation and younger, who know Israel only as a significant power that seems to be in no existential danger. For the generation that remembered the Holocaust and remembered the founding of Israel, and Leonard Cohen was one of those people. Cohen was born in 1934. So he was already, aware of what was going on during World War II. So for people who remembered that, Israel seemed incredibly vulnerable. And for people who remembered the existential dread that preceded the Six-Day War, when it seemed that Israel was about to be destroyed by superior forces, then when Israel was in trouble, it kind of, I write this in the book, it was like it was like the bat signal. It was a distress signal, and people were just mobilized to help. So, if people would volunteer to work on kibbutzim, people would show up, people would donate money, doctors would fly to Israel and volunteer to work in military hospitals. And that happened in 67, although the war was so quick in 67 that it was hard to get here in time to help. And it was pretty clear that the army had it under control early on. In the case of the Yom Kippur War, many volunteers arrived, and I give a few examples, not just Cohen, but surgeons who heard about the war during Yom Kippur services in America and got on a flight, a surgeon from South Africa, people who just had to be here or had to help in some way. And one of them was Leonard Cohen. Cohen at the time was living on a Greek island called Hydra, and he was very unhappy. He was at a creative dead end. He'd had major hits. So this is after Suzanne and after, So Long Marianne. He was a major figure in the 60s scene, but he really felt that he was done. And he was 39 years old. So at 39, as a rock star, you're pretty much done, certainly at that time. At that time, if you were really cool, the thing to do was die when you were 27. That's what Hendrix did, and that's what Janis Joplin did, and that's what Jim Morrison did. And here Cohen is 39. I mean, he's really ancient, and he's living with a woman named Suzanne, who's not Suzanne from the song Suzanne. She's a different Suzanne. And they have a child together who's 1 year old. So he's a father for the first time. He's in an unhappy relationship. He's at an age that's just prime age for a male midlife crisis. And not that I would know that personally, but so I've heard about 39. And he is in a dark point of his life. And he's on this Greek island, and he hears on the radio that, as he writes, he is listening on the radio to the war between the Arabs and the Jews. He hears that a war has broken out in Israel, and something in him is moved to go. And part of it is that he has to get out of his own crisis. He's an artist in crisis. He's a man in crisis, and he needs to escape. And Israel's crisis suggests a way out of his own crisis. That's part of what's going on. And part of it is that he's a Jew, and he feels that very deeply. And he comes from a very committed Jewish family. He grows up in a synagogue called Shar Shamayim, which is really the flagship of Judaism in Montreal, one of the great Canadian Jewish institutions. And he just has this tribal pull to Israel. And he walks out of this fisherman's cottage where he lives on Hydra, and he walks down the stairs to the port. There are no cars on Hydra to this day, so he walks down to the docks, gets on a ferry to Athens, in Athens, he finds a flight to Tel Aviv. It's not easy to get on the flights to Tel Aviv because so many Israeli men are trying to get back to join their reserve units, but somehow he manages to get on a flight and he inserts himself into this Middle Eastern catastrophe in October 73.
It's really striking. And of course, it's a very different thing when you're talking about that people also wanted to come to Israel during the Six-Day War. It's a very different thing to try to come to a war that seems like it's in good hands, you know, where you're going to show up and be on the winning side, than it is to come when things are looking quite dire. And so it's a very different, you know, psychology. And so it's interesting to read about all these stories of the people, including Leonard, who came. And I know that you have some photos from one of those people who came to Israel and was a photographer and wound up taking several photos of Leonard Cohen's tour. So I can give you a moment to share your screen and bring some of them up, and people can look at them while we're talking. And while you're doing that, I can set up the next question here, which is
let me see if I can.
Okay.
Technology is not my strong suit, so let me see if I can share the screen, and I'll show you what the tour looked like, because it's so striking. I think sometimes when people hear about this tour, they imagine like a Bob Hope kind of tour. So it's, you know, big kind of amphitheaters or bases in the rear, far from the front lines, or that scene from Apocalypse Now, where the Playboy bunnies come down in the helicopter. That's not what this was. This was completely improvised. It's a small group of musicians in a Jeep in the desert, and they're driving along, and when they see soldiers in the sand, they stop and play for them. And you'll see the pictures. Leonard Cohen is just, you know, kneeling in the sand, surrounded by soldiers. Sometimes there's an amp, sometimes there isn't. Sometimes there's a stage made of ammunition crates. Sometimes there's nothing. So it's just this very rough and very raw artistic transmission. No money is changing hands. Everyone is sober. Music is a matter of life and death, and something really powerful is going on. So let me see if I can show you. Let's do it like that. Okay. So what you're seeing, I hope, in this photograph is a convoy of Israeli vehicles moving up toward the Suez Canal for the great counterattack that changes the course of the war. You can see in the foreground there's a soldier smoking a cigarette with his, you know, face turned away from the camera. That's Yoshua Cohen, and he was killed about 3 hours after the photograph was taken. This is another just great photograph to get the atmosphere of the soldiers in the desert. It was taken by a photographer named Isaac Shoka, who's one of the characters in the book. He's an Israeli, but he was in Tokyo when the war broke out and had to kind of fight to get back to Israel and join his friends at the front. And he eventually became a professional photographer. He's quite well known. At the time, he was an amateur, but he had a Nikon, and he took just beautiful photographs of his friends and eventually of Leonard Cohen, who they met really out of nowhere in the desert. This is what the concerts felt like. This isn't Cohen playing, this is a woman playing, but this is kind of what the concerts in the desert felt like. It would just be soldiers gathered around between battles, and a musician or a few musicians who were like aliens coming from this other world that was Tel Aviv to play for guys who were, who knew this might be the last thing that they ever heard. And there's the man himself. This is at a concert that's actually on the far side of the Suez Canal. So Leonard Cohen crosses the Suez Canal, a day or two behind the Israeli army. He's not keeping a safe distance from the front. He is right there with the soldiers. At one point in his own writing about the war, he says that he went to the war to stop an Egyptian bullet. And I'm not sure if that expressed a real death wish on his part, but he was certainly deeply depressed at the time, and had many different motivations for going to the war. Some of them, I think, quite dark. There's Cohen again, and here you can see that he seems transported by the concert. I mean, he sees something powerful is going on. This is not a regular concert. To his left and to our right in the yellow T-shirt is the Israelis on the call will recognize Matti, one of the great Israeli musicians. At the time, not yet well known. He was just 23 years old, but he was one of the 3 musicians who accompanied Cohen on the tour. And here we have a great photograph, maybe one of the great Jewish photographs of the 20th century. If you've seen a photograph of this tour, you've probably seen this shot taken by a reserve soldier who just happened to be there, not a professional, a guy named Yaakov Doron, who I met while researching the book. And here you see a few great figures. You see Matti Friedman in the yellow t-shirt. You see Leonard Cohen in the middle. And standing to the left of Cohen is, of course, General Ariel Sharon. So you have a picture with these 2 great Jewish archetypes in it. One is, the great diaspora figure, the poet, the universal artist, Leonard Cohen. And next to him, you have the ultimate Israeli, the man of war, the man of the land, Ariel Sharon. And there's a very interesting interaction between them that Leonard Cohen describes in the manuscript that he wrote about the war. Sharon, by the way, for his part, seems not to have remembered that Leonard Cohen was there and never mentioned him ever, as far as I could tell. So the impression was not as strong going both ways. That's it. That just gives you a sense of, what it looked like, what it felt like.
Quite haunting photos, really, really stunning. It's so cool that you were able to come across these and incorporate them into the narrative. Just to really emphasize, why was it such a big deal that Leonard Cohen was crossing the Suez Canal during the Yom Kippur War? Like this is like right on the front lines, right?
It's quite amazing. I mean, when I first heard about it, I didn't get that is what's going on. Also, it's crazy for the army to let an international star get to the front line. Like, what if something happened to Leonard Cohen? And anyone who knows Israel understands that this place is completely chaotic at the best of times. And in a war, of course, no one has any idea what's going on. So it's my impression that the musicians were just going wherever they wanted. I mean, we have this testimony that's in the book where the army has just crossed the Suez Canal. It's the thickest fighting of the war. It's really the turning point of the war. And Cohen shows up. He somehow crossed the Suez Canal, and he is, playing. He's sitting on a helmet on the sand, strumming a guitar on Egyptian territory that has just been captured by the army. That's barely under the control of the Israeli army. So that makes very little sense unless you understand how Israel works, which is just, completely disorganized. And I guess the musicians wanted to go there, so they did. The tour was not organized by anyone. And I went to the Army archive when I started my research to see if there was any record of the tour. So I asked them who organized the tour, because if it was the Education Corps, then I could look for documentation from the Education Corps. And I thought I might find dates of the concerts, locations of the concerts, but they just laughed at me at the archive, because of course no one organized the tour. Cohen just showed up. He just showed up in Israel, by the way, not intending to play. He showed up, he seems to have intended to volunteer on a kibbutz. He told people that he wanted to pick grapefruit. And he had announced that year that he was retiring from music. So he seems not to have come as a musician. He didn't come as Leonard Cohen, the rock star. He kind of comes as a pilgrim. And he bums around Israel for a couple of days. And I found this fantastic manuscript that he wrote and never published about this. And he described just bumming around Israel, meeting some people, not really knowing how he was going to fit into this story. And then he's sitting in a cafe in Tel Aviv when he's recognized by a few Israeli musicians. And these are actually quite famous musicians, but Leonard Cohen has no idea who they are. And they come over to his table and they say, "Excuse me, are you Leonard Cohen?" Because it makes no sense that Leonard Cohen is in Tel Aviv in the middle of the Yom Kippur War. And Leonard says, "Yeah, I'm Leonard Cohen." And he tells them his plan, to pick grapefruit. And they say, "You're not picking grapefruit, you're coming with us. We're going down to the front to play for soldiers, and you're coming with us." And that's how this story, unfolds, but it's very ad hoc and not planned or organized by anyone, let alone by Leonard Cohen himself.
It's very striking. It sort of adds to the haunting quality of the whole tour. I would like to ask about a question that a few people have sent in now, and that is concerning kind of recent documents that have been made public, recent revelations or some, whatever you want to call them, about kind of what the Israeli government was talking about and what they knew leading up to the Yom Kippur War. Reports that there had been, peace talks rejected, that there had been conversations about the West Bank that could have led to the prevention of the war. To talk a little bit about your understanding of what was transpiring then, and sort of what the collective Israeli knowledge of that history is.
Sure. I mean, I can speak about it in a broad way. I'm not a historian of the Yom Kippur War beyond the minute slice of the Yom Kippur War that involved Leonard Cohen, which is of course a very small piece of the war and a completely unimportant piece of the war if what we're interested in is the war's outcome. Leonard Cohen did not sway the outcome of the Yom Kippur War. But the story, I think, ends up being one of the great stories of the Yom Kippur War. But it's in a way that has nothing to do with military strategy or anything. But yes, it's true. I mean, Israel was warned. Israel was warned by the king of Jordan that war was about to break out. Israel was warned by elements of the intelligence apparatus that war was about to break out. Other elements of the intelligence services dismissed those warnings, and that's really what people remember about the war. The great account of the war is called Hatzofeh Shenirdam, the watcher who fell asleep, because there were these warnings, and the Egyptian army was fully mobilized on the front, and Israel convinced itself that this was a training exercise, and part of it was that the Arab armies were tricking Israel in a way that was actually quite smart and which worked. And part of it was that Israel was tricking itself. Israel had convinced itself that there was no real threat, that the victory in 67 had been so conclusive that there was nothing to fear. And that was completely wrong. And the people who paid the price for that error were the poor infantrymen and tank crews who were on the borders on October 6th, or were sent to the borders to kind of save the day. And many of them were just sent into an absolute slaughter. So there was intense anger after that war. There was a protest movement. One of the great Israeli protest movements starts after the war with a single soldier, a demobilized infantry officer, who just stands outside the prime minister's office with a sign by himself. A guy named Matti Ashkenazi, who's still alive, lives in Jerusalem, and that eventually balloons into a protest movement that leads to the resignation of the prime minister, and eventually, to Labor's loss of power. So, yes, I mean, the stories about Israel ignoring warnings is true. The stories are true. And Golda, who's remembered as a kind of heroic character for American Jews, she's still kind of venerated in America, in part because she was kind of American Golda, and because she was a great woman. And in Israel, she's a very controversial character. She's not beloved in Israel, and she's not beloved because she's blamed for rightly or wrongly, she's blamed for the failure of that war. She was the prime minister, so she bore ultimate responsibility, and the government didn't see it coming.
This sort of leads into one of the more poetic motifs in your book, which people can probably guess from the title, is that how you show how Leonard's music is so often about atonement, and that Israel was fighting a war on the Day of Atonement, and was in fact, you say, fighting a war of atonement. That it didn't just fall on Yom Kippur, but it sort of seemed like Israel was needing to repent, was sort of reciting its own Unatana Tokef, and was considering its own fate. Can you talk about how you understand that metaphor? What were Israelis feeling judged for?
I think mainly for that euphoria, for the pride. Israel had committed the sin of pride and was punished for it. I mean, who knows, if things are actually that simple, but that's an important part of the memory of the war, and the fact that it breaks out on Yom Kippur. I mean, if I was a novelist and I had invented that, it would be ludicrous, but it actually happened. And you mentioned Unatane Tokef, which is a prayer that we just read, of course, on Yom Kippur, and that's really, in some ways, the height of the service. It's this really wild prayer where we hear God described as a king sitting on a throne, judging us for the coming year, and deciding who will live and who will die. And not just who will live and who will die, but how. Who by water, and who by fire, and who by sword, and who by wild beast, and who by earthquake. And people recite this prayer in synagogue, and then a short time afterward, a siren goes off across the country, and people are sent to die precisely in the ways described in the prayer. So when Leonard Cohen shows up in Israel, he shows up amidst this Yom Kippur that's really extended for 3 weeks. Yom Kippur doesn't end that year. People, are called out of synagogue. They don't blow the shofar. They don't hear the shofar at the end of Yom Kippur. The Day of Atonement stretches until the end of the war, and people are sent to their deaths in ways that had just been recited in synagogue. Again, if you made that up, it would seem ludicrous, but that's actually what happened. And that experience quite clearly has something to do with the song that Leonard Cohen writes immediately after the war, which is Who by Fire. And he's such a cagey character, Leonard Cohen, that he'll never tell us exactly what the connection is. So he'll never say, I had this experience and sat down and wrote this poem, because he doesn't want to be tied down as a poet to concrete experiences. He's not a lowly journalist like me or like you, Andrew. He's an artist, and he's up to something else. But the fact that he pens a song called Who by Fire immediately after the Yom Kippur War, in which he had participated, it's clearly no coincidence. And he riffs on the prayer. It's kind of a Leonard Cohen version of the prayer, where he adds other ways you could die, 20th century ways you could die: loneliness, suicide, drugs. And in some ways, his song, I think, is more famous today than the prayer. And not only that, the tune that he wrote for his version of the prayer has now migrated back into synagogue and is often sung as part of the liturgy. So you have this incredible Jewish story where you have this prayer, Unetane Tokef, which is a medieval prayer. We don't know exactly when it was written, but about 1,000 years ago. And describes terrible violence being committed against Jews in medieval Europe. And then the prayer leaves wherever it was written, and it bangs around the Jewish world for a millennium, and it ends up in Yemen and in Poland and in Russia and in Morocco and in Montreal at the end of the world, where some Jewish kid growing up at Shar Shamayim in Montreal hears this prayer. And it's obviously, if you're sensitive to language, it is a crazy text, and it's obviously going to make an impression. So this kid kind of remembers the prayer and then heads off out of the synagogue and ends up in the 60s and in the village with Dylan and Nico and Judy Collins, Joan Baez, and the whole crew. Ends up in a war in Israel that starts on Yom Kippur, has his memory jogged somehow, writes a version of the prayer, and then his version of the prayer ends up back in the synagogue. I mean, it's an incredible intellectual Jewish journey.
Absolutely, it is. You mentioned earlier that the Yom Kippur War also changed Israel politically, and I would love to understand a little bit more of that. Obviously, you talked about labor Zionists sort of losing power after this, but what happens in its wake, and how are people tracing this back to the events of the war?
The original leadership of Israel, the Ben Gurion was out of the picture by the time the Yom Kippur War came around, but the country was being run by his heirs. And these people were seen as almost miracle workers. I mean, they had willed a country into existence against impossible odds. And then they'd won this incredible victory in 67, and they'd been vindicated. And then 73 showed them to be feckless. I mean, they'd completely messed up, and they'd failed to see very clear warning signals. And they were punished for it. And in some ways, the punishment continues to this day. I mean, a lot of what's going on in Israel now is linked to that divide, to the divide between the founders of Israel and their descendants, and people who have always seen themselves as outsiders, but people who were empowered after the war, people who came to power after the Yom Kippur War. So Likud at the moment is leading a kind of coalition of a lot of people who see themselves as outsiders, the ultra-Orthodox, for example, religious Zionists, and Jews who came to Israel from Arab countries, what we would call Mizrahim, people whose roots are in the Islamic world, who were always kind of kept on the margins in the years when the labor Zionists were running the show. So they are kind of kept on the margins, but then come into their own after the Yom Kippur War. And we're still in many ways fighting that fight, which is a ridiculous fight in my opinion, but it's still a fight between, the descendants of the founders and the descendants of the outsiders. And that fight that comes to a head right after the Yom Kippur War, culminating in a Likud victory in 1977, is very much in play in the protests that we now see in Israel, and the government that we now have. And the echoes are with us. I don't think we can really understand current events in Israel without understanding the Yom Kippur War.
Yeah, I mean the long tail of its legacy, as you say, the events unfolding in Israel right now, which JTA has been covering pretty diligently, and which you yourself have been pretty outspoken about. You're saying that they have the psychology of them seems to be rooted in the Yom Kippur War from 50 years ago.
Definitely, or the Yom Kippur War was kind of a breaking point that really kind of brought those fissures to the fore. I mean, the dividing line in Israel goes back to the state's founding, but there was no challenging the labor Zionist leadership before the Yom Kippur War. It was only after that catastrophe that other voices begin to assert themselves, voices from the left and voices from the right, and voices that you didn't hear before in the years of of the hegemony of the kibbutz movement. And there's a lot that's good about that. And there's some things that aren't good about that, but that old Israel of the folk music, the kibbutz, the pioneers, the Israel that really still lives on in some ways in North America, in summer camps, in Jewish schools, in Israel that really dies with Yom Kippur, or it's dealt a death blow in the Yom Kippur War because of the disaster of that war.
Mm. Which is odd, because I remember hearing about the Yom Kippur War in my own Hebrew school growing up, and it was framed in a really interesting way with the 6-Day War, where it was, Israel is this miracle that there was this incredible victory, but then also it is intensely vulnerable at all times, and we need to be on guard. There was an edge, and I don't know, I have no idea if this is a universal experience for other young Jews, but it seemed like we were being taught both truths simultaneously. I'm curious if that was also the case for you, if that's the case for Israelis today.
Yes, I mean, I think that's the Israeli story in many ways. It's this kind of bravado and this intense vulnerability, this sense that we can do anything, and also that we're going to be extinct tomorrow. And you have to understand the two halves of the Israeli character in order to understand how polar the emotions here can be. One day we're on top of the world, and the next day it's the Holocaust all over again. And those two wars are a way of understanding it, right? There's the 67 pole and the 73 pole. There's the height of that great victory, and then the depths of the Yom Kippur surprise. And yeah, that's the country. I mean, it really is kind of a manic depressive country, and it can be very tiring to live here for that reason. It would be nice if things were a bit more Canadian, where people were just kind of comatose all the time, but what can we do? We're in the Middle East, so it's never boring. Right now we're experiencing a crisis which to many people seems worse than the Yom Kippur War, and which seems ludicrous, because in Yom Kippur more than 2,600 people died, and now no one has died, but it's a crisis that's being generated internally. It's coming from inside. The society seems to be breaking apart, and people seem to be at each other's throats, and it's being compared to Yom Kippur in terms of the kind of the depth of the sense of crisis. And this anniversary of Yom Kippur has been interesting because, of course, the war has been on everyone's mind, but at the same time, the current internal crisis is on everyone's mind. And in some ways, people are nostalgic for the days of the Yom Kippur War, when the enemy was someone else. Mm-hmm. That in some ways, people miss that. There was we were together against an external enemy and not divided by internal strife. So problems come and problems go, but it's never really relaxing over here.
Many of the veterans of the war whom you interview for the book, we see them at the other end often very changed. Was it the war that changed them? Was the war still on their minds, all these years later?
I think so. I think that it was. I mean, part of it was that they were 18 at the time of the war, and when I met them, they were grandparents, and it was actually quite an amazing thing to have that kind of perspective. And many of them were at the concert in 2009, which is where the book ends. So many of the characters who you meet in the book as soldiers are actually at that concert as grandparents, and they've aged, and Cohen's aged, and Israel's aged, but they're all still here, and they're different than they were, but they shared this experience. And yes, I mean, I think that for many or most of them, the Yom Kippur War was the formative experience. This was the most terrifying thing that ever happened to them, the most formative thing the most exciting thing. It was just 3 weeks, or it was actually a bit longer because it didn't quite end after 3 weeks, but it was just 3 weeks of sheer terror, and that kind of experience changes you and you never forget it. And the appearance of Leonard Cohen amid these events was so strange that, amid unforgettable events, the appearance of Leonard Cohen for many of these soldiers was among the most unforgettable things, because it was so unexpected, because he was an alien from outer space. Because what was Leonard Cohen doing in Sinai? And they, for those lucky enough to see him and lucky enough to just experience what those concerts were, it was something that they never forgot.
I want to ask a couple of questions that have been coming into the chat. One of them, it refers to a very disturbing account that you tell in the book, which is that whenever parents of an Israeli soldier would try to call a base to try to contact their son or daughter, if their child was already dead, those on the phone were told to only say that they can't come to the phone right now. When you think about elements like this, do you think that contributed at all to the sort of crisis in leadership, or the lack of trust in leadership that that sort of gripped the country after this?
That's an interesting question that hadn't occurred to me. Certainly the facts of what was going on at the front were hidden from the public. In the first part of the war, things were so bad that the government kept it from the public. And the number of fatalities was so high that the notification apparatus was overwhelmed. So they just couldn't keep up with the pace of people being killed. And sometimes the friends of the soldiers would know that they'd been killed, but the parents hadn't been notified yet. And there's a terrible story that I tell in the book, which is a story about women soldiers at a radar station in Sinai, where one of the soldiers is killed, and the parents don't know, and they're calling the base. They understand something's wrong. They haven't heard from the soldier, and they're calling, and this poor telephone operator is instructed to say nothing, to say that the soldier just can't come to the phone. And eventually they stop calling, so she concludes that someone has told them. But something like that would be unthinkable in Israel today. But in the Yom Kippur War, yes. I mean, there are stories about parents coming to the front right when the war was over to look for their kids, and there was disorganization. It was just a tragic mess. So it wasn't necessarily that the government was tricking everyone, although there was some of that. They didn't want to shatter people's morale. Part of it was just disorganization and the fact that this was a catastrophe that no one had prepared for. But yes, in some cases, it took weeks for families to be notified that someone had been killed.
We've also had a couple questions about how the Yom Kippur War is taught to Israeli students today. Someone points out that you could say that after the war, in addition to a lot of what we've been talking about, there were peace treaties signed with Egypt and Jordan, and there were other political developments that one could frame as positive. And so I'm just curious, like how is it taught in schools? What lessons are being sort of internalized, especially in this moment?
The main lesson of the Yom Kippur War is that the political leadership failed and the common soldier saved the day. That's really like the simple story of the Yom Kippur War. The big guys screwed up and the little guys saved the country. And it is true to a large extent. And there are a lot of people asking if we still have what it takes to do that now. And if we still have the spirit of volunteerism, if we still have the social solidarity. It's a very different country than it was in 1973. It's a much more individualistic country. It's not that collective we country. It's much more of an I country. And if there were a crisis like Yom Kippur today, would our army be able to handle it? Would people just volunteer in droves? Would people sacrifice themselves to save the country? It's a good question. I mean, I think we still have a lot of that energy. I'm not sure we have the same energy. And there's this anxiety in the country when faced with these stories of heroism, because it really asks us if we still have that, if we still have what it takes. And many people are asking that question now as things kind of splinter and as the solidarity that Israelis always felt for each other and for the country really seems to be fraying. And the Yom Kippur War kind of really places kind of an image in front of us and forces us to ask the question, could that happen again? And if it happened again, what would we do? Good questions.
Yes, they were good questions. Thank you everyone for those tonight. Just a couple more that we have time for, but You said that one of the casualties of the war was the accordion, which is sort of you talk about in the book how the history of Israeli music is intertwined with the history of the military, and that this was kind of the dual world that Leonard Cohen was stepping into on his tour. Tell us a bit more about how Israeli music, Israeli culture sort of shifted around the contours of the war.
Right. So, before the war, it was that old Israeli, folk music that many of us probably remember, and much of the top 40 music was produced by military entertainment troops. Right. Some military units had their own bands, and the bands were so good that they were writing hits. And of course, it was very much kind of ideologically, mobilized music. Let's go, music about famous battles. One famous song is called Givat HaTachmoshet, Ammunition Hill, about a famous battle in the Six-Day War. Sovi Mamtera, like the song about making the desert boom. And that music is just killed by the Yom Kippur War. That you really don't hear much of that music after the war. And instead, what you start hearing is kind of singer-songwriters type music that's much more open to God, which is interesting. Like, the Israeli founding generation had been militantly secular, and the Yom Kippur War leads many Israelis to come back to religion, including one of the musicians who tours with Cohen, a guy named Pupi Kaunon, who I talk about in the book. He was kind of a hash-smoking bohemian from Tel Aviv at the time of the war. When I met him, his name was Rabbi Mordechai Arnon, and he was, an ultra-Orthodox Jew who lived in Jerusalem. And that was because of the war. So the war leads people to be open to God. The war makes people more concerned with the individual and the soul. And the war makes the music sound much more like Leonard Cohen than it had. So you have artists like Meir Ariel, one of the great Israeli singers, Shalom Chanoch, kind of singer-songwriter types like Leonard Cohen, who are no longer mobilized. They're not singing, to raise morale. It's a different kind of music, and that really happens in the war. And it doesn't happen because Leonard Cohen is present in the war, but Leonard Cohen is here. And certainly Leonard Cohen, after the war and to this day, is certainly one of the foreign artists who Israelis love the most. I think I'm not going out too far on a limb if I say he's the foreign artist that Israelis love the most. He's probably the artist who's translated most into Hebrew. New Cohen covers come out all the time, and he has this staying power in Israeli culture, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that he's amazing. That probably is most of it, but the familial love people feel for Cohen has something to do with the fact that at one of the greatest moments of crisis for Israel, he came. He didn't have to come, but he did, and Israelis have never forgotten it.
Yes. This has all been wonderful. Let's end on kind of the last big picture question, if we can. Some variation of what we've been talking about, all night. But looking back at the 50 years since the war, what do you think Jews should be thinking about when we look ahead to the current challenges that Israel is facing today?
I think we're at a moment of crisis, right? We're at a moment of great division, not just in Israel, but it's a divisive time everywhere. That just seems to be the vibe of 2023. It's a divisive time in America. It's a divisive time in many places, and these societies that we took for granted seem to be kind of splitting apart, and they will if we're not careful. I mean, I don't know that much about America, but I can tell you that Israel, if we don't get our act together, we're going to lose it. And that seems kind of incomprehensible when viewed from 20 years ago, but it's happening. And I think we have to really value what we have. We come to take for granted that we have democracies, that we have stable countries, that we have a Jewish state, right? Kids, even people my age or certainly younger, just take for granted that we have a Jewish state and do not understand that it's a miracle that we have a Jewish state. And that, my grandfather, when he was a kid, would hardly have believed it possible for the Jews to have a state, and we have one, and all you need to do to get there is go to the airport and get on an airplane. And I think that the fact that we take so much of this for granted is endangering it. We're not conscious enough of how valuable what we have is and how much has been achieved by the Jewish people since the Second World War. And I think we need to step back and just look at how much we have and realize what it would mean to lose it. And hopefully, if we do, the outcome will be will be better. And I think there are many reasons for optimism. I think if we pull through the Yom Kippur War, we can get through this as well. And we'll listen to the words of wisdom of people like Leonard Cohen and others who've described human reality so well, and read Jewish texts which have so much to offer in terms of guidance. And we'll get there, but we just need to get our act together and be careful. And just before we sign off, I just want to say thanks to you, Andrew. Those were wonderful questions, and thanks so much to JTA and to Theo Wieseltier of 70 Faces, and thanks to everyone who came out, especially the Canadians, but even the Americans are more than welcome. And it was really a pleasure, and I hope we all get to do it in person at some point.
Absolutely, that would be lovely. Matti, thank you so much for taking the time today. Thank you to everyone who came. The book, once again, is Who by Fire, Leonard Cohen in the Sinai. And it's a wonderful book. I definitely recommend. Please continue to support JTA, and thank you for your support, everybody. Thank you.